Poland needed tanks, not in the distant future, not later, but right now. December 15th, 2022. The Baltic coast, Poland. President Andrzej Duda stood at the port of Gdynia, surrounded by generals and ministers, all of them watching a cargo ship slowly unload its cargo onto Polish soil. 180 brand new battle tanks, over $1 billion of steel, guns, and electronics were delivered 5 months after the ink dried on the contract. No American manufacturer could do that. No German one either. The people who'd spent decades at the top of the global arms market stood on the sidelines and watched. The tanks were Korean. And to understand how that happened, how a country that didn't own a single tank ended up selling them to a NATO ally faster than anyone else on Earth could manage. So you have to go back to a morning in 1950 when South Korea almost stopped existing altogether. On June 25th on the Korean peninsula, while most of the South was still asleep, hundreds of T-34s crossed the 38th parallel and started moving. These were the same Soviet machines that had broken the back of Nazi armor at Kursk, battle-tested, heavy, and designed by people who understood exactly how to kill other tanks. South Korea met them with soldiers carrying light rifles. That was genuinely all they had. 72 hours later, Seoul was gone. The government had fled. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were walking south with whatever they could carry on their backs, abandoning homes, businesses, entire lives. South Korea had been compressed into a single province. A small, desperate perimeter huddled around the port city of Busan at the very bottom of the peninsula, clinging on. America sent what it had nearby. That meant M24 Chaffee tanks, light reconnaissance vehicles built during the Second World War for scouting, not for trading fire with Soviet armor. The T-34 weighed 32 tons and carried a 76mm cannon. The Chaffee weighed 18 tons with a slightly smaller gun. In the first engagements, American shells hit T-34s and bounced off. Soviet shells hit Chaffees and went straight through. It wasn't really a battle. It was a demonstration of what happens when you bring the wrong equipment to the wrong fight. MacArthur's landing at Incheon in September eventually turned things around. But the war ground on for 3 more years, ugly and attritional, before both sides signed an armistice at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953. Not a peace treaty, just an agreement to stop shooting for a while. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war today. The strip of land between them became the most heavily fortified border on the planet. South Korea came out of that war carrying a lesson that went bone deep. A country that had nearly been erased from the map in 3 days because it had no armor was never going to let that happen again. The problem was that in the 1950s and 60s, South Korea was desperately poor. Per capita income lower than many African countries. The idea of building tanks domestically wasn't ambitious, it was delusional. So they took what America offered. Outdated machines, leftovers from previous wars, passed along as military aid to an ally too poor to ask for better. They knew it wasn't enough. They just couldn't do anything about it yet. By the early 1970s, the situation got genuinely alarming. South Korean intelligence reported that North Korea had opened its own tank factory and was producing T-62s. This wasn't a surplus machine from someone else's war. The T-62 was modern and purpose-built, carrying a 115mm smoothbore cannon that could punch through the armor of any Western tank of that era. South Korea's answer to this was a fleet of M48 Pattons shipped over from Vietnam, still carrying Southeast Asian dust. After repairs, they functioned, but they were 1950s machines facing a 1970s threat and the gap between what Pyongyang had and what Seoul had was getting wider every single year. Then, things took another turn. President Nixon's foreign policy doctrine meant the U.S. would no longer fully protect its allies. The American military presence began to leave South Korea, and the country was left to fend for itself. Park Chung-hee went to Washington, asking for M60A1 tanks to counter the T-62. The U.S. refused, offering more used M48 Pattons instead. They weren't the solution South Korea needed, and Park knew it. He understood that relying on America's leftovers wasn't a long-term strategy. It was a slow surrender. The only solution was to build their own defense industry. But the challenge was enormous. South Korea had no experience in armored vehicle manufacturing. They lacked factories, trained engineers, or any knowledge of how to design and build tanks. The country that had nearly been wiped off the map in 1950 had spent the following 2 decades doing everything but learning how to defend itself. Washington agreed to send engineers to Alabama to learn the basics of defense production, but that was just a start. By 1976, satellite photos confirmed the worst. North Korea's factory was in full swing, cranking out new T-62s at an alarming rate. Park's response was immediate. He called in the chairman of one of South Korea's biggest industrial conglomerates and gave a clear order: build a tank factory. What followed became an embarrassing footnote in the story. In Korean, the words for tank and train sound almost identical. The businessman left the meeting thinking he had been told to build a railway factory. His secretary, who was present, caught the mistake just before they reached the elevator. South Korea's entire plan to build tanks almost turned into a railway expansion project. The country urgently needed a foreign technology partner, and the search began right away. The obvious choice was Chrysler Defense, the company that built American tanks. It seemed like the natural ally for a country that had been using American military equipment for decades. Korean representatives went to the U.S. to lay out their needs. Chrysler's response was an offer to assemble the M60A3, an outdated tank model. From Chrysler's view, it was a reasonable proposal, but for South Korea, it was an insult. They needed something far more capable to take on what North Korea was building. South Korea rejected the offer and quietly started talks with West Germany. Krauss-Maffei, the company behind the Leopard 1 tank, was genuinely interested in a partnership. Both sides negotiated secretly, fearing that Washington would intervene and block any transfer of German military technology. American intelligence caught wind of it almost immediately. Fearing the loss of South Korea to a German partnership, Chrysler changed its approach. In 1977, they returned with a far more enticing offer: joint development of a brand new tank based on the M1 Abrams, still in prototype stage and representing the cutting edge of American military technology. For Seoul, which had only received outdated equipment, this was an offer they couldn't refuse. On December 1st, 1978, both governments signed a contract for 2 prototypes. The project was named ROKET, standing for Republic of Korea Indigenous Tank, symbolizing full independence. However, the contract told a different story. The Americans provided advanced composite armor with the same material that would later protect the Abrams on battlefields, but hidden in the agreement were 44 critical components deemed restricted. Korean engineers couldn't access, study, or replicate them. Every future export of tanks from this project would require approval from Washington, and South Korea would have to pay royalties on every unit produced. They were being given the illusion of independence while the Americans held on to control. Inside the joint development facility, engineers from both nations shared offices, desks, and break rooms. At water coolers and coffee machines, American engineers, perhaps out of pride or camaraderie, shared technical details beyond what the contract allowed. When Chrysler's management found out, they quickly built a wall down the middle of the office. The two teams were separated, and the Koreans were assigned specific corridors to prevent any unauthorized interaction. But it was too late. By the time the wall went up, the Koreans had already absorbed enough to understand the restricted systems. They had watched, listened, and learned everything they needed to set up their own independent production line. And when the time came, they would reverse engineer much of what they were explicitly forbidden from accessing. The wall Chrysler built didn't protect American technology. It just told South Korea exactly how much further it still needed to go on its own. The two prototypes shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. What followed was a disaster. The vehicle failed to climb a 60-degree incline. During one trial, the engine caught fire, forcing an immediate evacuation. In cold weather, the targeting optics shook uncontrollably. The ballistic computer crashed under electromagnetic interference. The list of failures was long and humiliating for both sides. Months of corrections followed before General Dynamics, which had acquired Chrysler Defense in 1982, delivered a revised prototype designated PV-1, accompanied by 1,300 pages of documentation. Korean engineers went through every page. The blueprints were incomplete, insufficient for independent manufacturing. The Americans had handed over a manual that described what the tank did without fully explaining how to build it yourself. South Korea pressed ahead regardless. The machine that rolled out of the factory was designated the K-1. It worked. It was capable. And it looked strikingly familiar. American soldiers stationed in Korea took one look at it and started calling it the Baby Abrams. The nickname carried a patronizing edge, as though South Korea had produced a toy version of the real thing rather than a serious piece of military hardware. Korean officials accepted the label with mixed feelings and said nothing publicly. But privately, the deeper problem was impossible to ignore. Nearly 80% of the K-1's components were imported. The engine came from abroad. The transmission came from abroad. The electronics, the composite armor, the critical systems that made the tank actually function, all of it came from the United States. South Korea had assembled a tank. It had not built one. Among politicians, generals, and engineers, a painful consensus began forming. Many said it openly. The K-1 was a national humiliation. The argument wasn't that the tank was bad. The argument was that it wouldn't exist at all if South Korea had possessed sufficient technology of its own. The strategic reality was even starker. In a real conflict, and South Korea was still technically in one foreign supply lines could be severed overnight. An army that couldn't manufacture its own critical components wasn't truly independent. It was dependent on the goodwill of suppliers who had already demonstrated repeatedly that they were willing to say no. The next generation tank would have to be different. Completely different. It would have to wait. In the early 1990s, a recession hit South Korea, and the military refused to absorb additional spending during a period of budget cuts. Then in 1997, the Asian financial crisis swept across the continent like a demolition crew. The Korean won lost half its value in weeks. Major corporations that had seemed untouchable collapsed overnight. The International Monetary Fund arrived with an emergency rescue package to prevent a complete economic collapse. Under those conditions, Allocating billions to a new armored vehicle wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a conversation. But once the economy began to stabilize, the ambition came back. The Agency for Defense Development, South Korea's equivalent of DARPA, received a clear directive from the government: design and build a completely indigenous main battle tank, not assembled from foreign parts, not dependent on foreign licenses, not subject to foreign approval or foreign royalties. A tank that owed nothing to any outside power. The Korean Army knew exactly what it wanted. Between 2003 and 2007, 5 prototypes were constructed to test different technologies and configurations. The final prototype was unveiled in March 2007. 18 months later, in September 2008, the Defense Acquisition Program Administration evaluated the vehicle and certified it ready for combat service. The entire development cycle from initial research to battlefield certification had taken 13 years. They named it the Black Panther. The name was chosen deliberately. Korean military doctrine called for a tank as agile as a panther hunting through the mountainous forests that cover much of the peninsula. Speed and maneuverability would make it as lethal as the predator it was named after. Production responsibility fell to Hyundai Rotem, a subsidiary of the Hyundai Motor Group. Partnering with them were Samsung Techwin and several other major Korean industrial firms, forming a consortium that brought together some of the largest manufacturing operations in Asia. This arrangement gave the Black Panther program an advantage that no Western tank manufacturer could match or fully understand. Hyundai and Samsung had spent decades building enormous factory complexes originally designed for automobile and electronics mass production. Converting portions of that capacity to defense manufacturing meant output rates that dwarfed anything achievable by the specialized Western arms producers, who typically operated smaller, dedicated facilities with limited throughput. The industrial machinery that built cars and semiconductors could now build tanks, and build them fast. The consortium set out to combine the best characteristics of the French Leclerc and the German Leopard 2, assembled entirely from Korean-developed or Korean-controlled technology. For the first time in the country's history, when every critical system would be designed, tested, and manufactured on Korean soil, or at minimum produced under full Korean ownership of the intellectual property. No foreign government would hold veto power over exports. No royalty payments would flow overseas. The Black Panther would belong entirely to South Korea. The main weapon is a 120mm smoothbore gun with a barrel length of 55 calibers, designated the CN8. The Agency for Defense Development designed it based on the German Rheinmetall L55, with production assigned to Hyundai WIA. The longer barrel gave the Korean gun a direct advantage over the L44, mounted on every version of the Abrams and on older Leopard 2s. The extra 1.3 meters of barrel length generates higher pressure during firing, producing greater muzzle velocity and better armor penetration at range. South Korea hadn't just matched the standard, it had deliberately exceeded it. The fire control system draws on technology from the French firm Thales, linking it to systems proven in the Leclerc. Once the gunner designates a target, the turret and gun track it automatically. The automation was designed with a specific reality in mind. South Korea relies heavily on conscript soldiers. The system had to be operable by someone with limited training under extreme stress. The crew consists of 3: a commander, a gunner, and a driver. A special interface permits emergency operation by 2 people. In extreme circumstances, A single soldier can keep the vehicle fighting. The engine was the hardest component to produce domestically. It almost wasn't produced domestically at all. The powertrain drives a 55-ton vehicle to 70 kilometers per hour on roads and 50 kilometers per hour across rough ground, with a range of 450 kilometers. A secondary gas turbine rated at 100 horsepower powers all onboard systems when the main diesel is shut down, allowing the crew to maintain full combat readiness while producing minimal heat and noise, cutting the thermal and acoustic signatures that enemy sensors depend on. The suspension combines hydropneumatic units with torsion bars alternating between road wheels. This hybrid system lets the driver raise or lower the hull on command. In the mountainous Korean terrain the tank was designed to fight in, it can crouch behind a ridge with only the turret exposed. It can also elevate the gun to extreme angles normally associated with mortars, firing indirectly over obstacles. A tank that behaves like artillery when the terrain demands it. Armor composition remains classified. Available estimates place frontal hull protection at 600 to 700 millimeters equivalent against kinetic penetrators and roughly 950 millimeters against shaped charges. The turret front is heavier rated between 1,100 and 1,300 millimeters against kinetic rounds, and 1,200 to 1,500 against chemical energy threats. Blowout panels in the ammunition compartment vent any internal explosion outward, protecting the crew from the catastrophic detonations that have become the defining image of inadequately protected tanks in recent conflicts. South Korea also developed a dedicated active protection system. A 3-coordinate radar and thermal imager detects incoming missiles and shells at up to 150 meters. With the onboard computer calculates the threat trajectory. A 70mm interceptor rocket launches to destroy it 10 to 15 meters from the hull. The full sequence from detection to interception takes between 2 and 3/10 of a second. The interceptors reach Mach 2. The Korean military originally planned to acquire 680 Black Panthers. That number was reduced to 390, then cut again to 297 as the defense budget came under sustained pressure. The reason was price. When the tank entered service in 2014, each unit cost approximately $8.5 million, nearly double the $4.9 million price of its predecessor, the K-1. But on the global market, the Korean machine was a relative bargain. The German Leopard 2A7 cost roughly $15 million per unit. The French Leclerc ran to approximately $16.6 million. The American Abrams came in around $8 million, but carried severe export restrictions that limited what buyers could actually do with the vehicle: after-purchase modifications, maintenance, resale, all subject to American approval. The Black Panther had none of those constraints, and the world was starting to notice. Production moved in stages. The first contract covered 100 tanks equipped with German MTU engines and Renk transmissions. On December 29, 2014, a second contract worth approximately $820 million was signed with the Ministry of National Defense for 55 vehicles, the first to carry the fully Korean powertrain. By 2023, roughly 225 Black Panthers were in active service with the Republic of Korea Army. Then came the deal that reshaped the global defense market overnight. On July 27, 2022, Poland and South Korea signed a framework agreement for 1,000 K2 tanks at an estimated value of $15 billion. one of the largest armored vehicle contracts in modern history. The first phase called for the rapid delivery of 180 tanks built in Korea. The second phase covered licensed production of a modified variant designated the K2PL at Polish factories operated by the PGZ defense conglomerate. Poland wasn't just buying finished vehicles. It was acquiring the ability to build them itself, developing its own industrial capability in the process. What separated this deal from every Western alternative wasn't the hardware. It was everything around it. American Abrams exports came wrapped in restrictions on maintenance, modification, and resale. Germany had spent years deliberating Leopard 2 transfers, repeatedly stalling for political reasons. South Korea imposed none of those barriers. Hyundai Rotem offered full technology transfer, complete documentation, and a delivery schedule no European or American competitor would even attempt. The contract was signed in late July 2022. By December 15th of that same year, 180 tanks were rolling off a cargo ship at the port of Gdynia. 5 months from signature to delivery of heavy main battle tanks shipped across an ocean. Defense analysts called it unprecedented. No Western manufacturer had demonstrated the capacity to produce and deliver that volume of complex armor in such a compressed window. The civilian mass production infrastructure that Hyundai, Samsung, and their partners had built over decades had just proven its military value in the most visible way possible. By December 2025, the all 180 first batch tanks were fully operational in Polish service with trained crews and complete integration into the national command structure. Poland had leapt from aging Soviet-era equipment to one of the most advanced tank fleets in Europe in under 3 years. With the full 1,000-vehicle order fulfilled, it is set to field the largest modern main battle tank force in the entire European Union. This story spans 75 years. It begins with a nation that had no tanks and nearly disappeared within 72 hours. It goes through decades of dependence on foreign surplus, a humbling first attempt at domestic production that was 80% imported parts and seen as a national embarrassment, financial crises that almost ended the effort, and a literal wall built to prevent engineers from learning too much. It ends with South Korea exporting cutting-edge armored vehicles to a NATO ally on the eastern edge of the Western Alliance, on terms the established powers of America and Europe could neither offer nor match.